Welcome to our 10th year of Great Decisions. Thank you to Barbara Forrest who started this for us way we got back when. And Kirk Ressler, who has kept us going for all of these years. We've kind of turned the Great Decisions into a shelter island Great Decisions. You're kind of making it work towards our needs because we have these amazing people on this island that have this amazing knowledge. And so sometimes we'll take a topic and just move it a little bit to make it fit. And we have the most amazing discussions. So I want to thank you all for coming. As you all know, we're doing a big construction project. So please come by and visit me at the library. If you come after 3:30 most weekdays, I'll take you over, put a hard hat on and take you over, and you can see the progress. It's moving along. We hope to be in by late fall, fingers crossed. And also, if you would like to get on the list so that you're notified about Great Decisions and other programs like this, there's a sign-up list at the back. So with that, again, welcome to our 10th year, and Kirk, I will get out of your day.
So it's nice to see you all again after the winter break. We started a little late this year, later than we normally do. And that's because some might argue that there are no great decisions being taken in Washington State. Anyway, tonight, this evening, we have Alasdair Findlay-Shirras, who has offered to speak to us on the question of Brexit and what has been the impact in the UK for the past 10 years. I can tell you from the State Department's point of view that we miss very much the UK being in the EU for two reasons. One is they used to tell us what was actually going on inside. And the other was that they had among the European economies, one of the more free and open, less regulated economies, which was more attuned to our own economy. So they were often willing to pitch our point of view to the rest of the EU and modify some of the EU policies. So we were very sad when the UK pulled out, but of course that was up to them. And the fellow who's in the White House now, actually for some reason, just because he's kind of against everything, was decided it was a good thing. He was supporting the UK, cheering them on. He was one of the biggest supporters of the UK. Anyway, without further ado, I will turn it over to Alasdair Findlay-Shirras, who is an international banker, worked both in Europe and in London, and lives here on Shelter Island as well as in London. So there's nobody better to speak about the impact of Brexit. Alasdair?
Because a lot of Israelis have to be very careful. But before we get into it, I just wanted to show you a short film, which just, I suppose, shows you that what goes on in America also goes on in other countries. And this is the messaging of the Brexit campaign, which was so fraught with misleading statements and lies, but was successful. And anyway, so we're going to start with it. So this is a film called Brexit, the Uncivil War. And it's not the whole film, it's just basically the trailer. And I looked at the trailer and I thought, God, that's enough. So have a look at that, and then I'll say a few words, and I hope we can have a good discussion. So that's the story that we were obviously sold in the UK, and clearly it was successful. It was 52 to 48%. But just a brief introduction. I mean, what you didn't really see was that, you saw a picture, obviously, actors playing Boris Johnson and Michael Kirk. And these were two guys who were very seasoned politicians. And both of them were on basically hedging their bets. And Boris apparently had written two memos, one saying he was going to support staying in, and the other one that he was going for Brexit. And both Gove and Boris Johnson, I think purely for personal sort of professional reasons, i.e. to get into number 10 and to run the country, they decided that Brexit had a better option for them. So, totally without any, I think, any moral background or much research as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. And of course, the arguments that you saw in that brief trailer, I'll go into, the pros and the cons, or the sort of the outcomes a little bit, so that you could see that obviously the feeling is today. So say it was 52-48 was pro-Brexit in those days. And I have no idea whether the 3 million talked about made a difference, because I don't know if they were able to be identified. But it would now be 60-40, 60 for basically not Brexit. So there's a big change based on obviously the economic impact of Brexit. And as a result, we're in a bit of a quandary. And we just talk through the pros and the cons and what our options are. And let's see if we come out with any good answers, and then we can go back to Westminster and tell them, because they certainly haven't found them yet. But just by way of introduction, and yes, I was a baby banker, and I spent 20 years in Manhattan as a banker with the City and Merrill and Bankers Trust and our German bank, and eventually spent time in Germany working for that German bank, and then also back in having retired from banking in sort of more what I suppose capital raising in London for the investment industry. And so we have three different cultures, and so I hope that I have if what I say is not totally off the beaten track. But what we should know is that in 1973, there was great that's when Britain went into the common market. There was great enthusiasm for it. So much so that when I took my exams to try and work in Brussels for a couple of years, they were full up of Brits, which is very unusual, because the Brits, not generally very good linguists. I mean, only marginally better than the Americans. And yet there was huge enthusiasm for the journey. And obviously Kirk mentioned a couple of reasons why we thought that we could play a role in Europe. And obviously there were other countries who wanted us to play a role in Europe. You may remember that the EU, European Union, was established in 52, right? In 52. And there were only a few sort of the West European countries who were in it. Now there are 27. It was 28 when we left, and there are a bunch of others. The Balkans and around Georgia and so forth, who are trying to get in, and have made applications. And even Turkey, which was one of the names that you saw typed out, sort of one of the excuses. But of course, the chances of Turkey getting in then were very, very small. And now I think zero. But anyway, I went to France to go to the European Business School, so that's based in Fontainebleau, and a lot of Brits. There was 30% Brits in those days, and now it's about 10% Brits. So you can see where what we have found is that the Dutch, the Belgians, the Nordics, all would like Britain there for the reasons that Kirk suggested, namely, that he could articulate a more of uh, um, uh, a capitalist model within a democracy, which is what we thought that America was at one time. And so it's very, what the struggle that, and the sad thing is that when we're confronting Europe now with 27 members that you have to convince, and I mean, it's just a staggering workload. And when you think of how wasteful the whole process was of spending, 2016, 10 years ago, we had the referendum. 2020, January 2020 was when we effectively left. And since then, we've been suffering the consequences. Because bear in mind that Europe is 50% of our trade. And we said, oh, we can do all sorts of other deals with other people. But, we did a small deal with Australia, with India. And of course, the big question mark was America. And the feeling was that we had a special relationship with America, which turned out to be rather limited in terms of we couldn't do any trade deals. And yet, obviously, prospectively, we hope that there are areas where we will continue to work intensely, like in defense, in the Secret Service, and all these sort of the things that are necessary to maintain the defense and success and the freedom of Western Europe versus Russia. So clearly I was pro-Europe. Would have, and certainly in 2016, when I was already back in Britain, I certainly weren't voted. So that may colour the way I present this whole issue, but that's where I'm coming from. So I have made some notes because there are so many reasons why people why Brexit took place. And you saw, what Benedict Cumberbatch, who is Dominic Cummings. So Dominic Cummings was the Mephistopheles of the Boris Johnson government. And clearly, I don't know whether he believed in Brexit really, but he certainly believed in turning around the political system and changing things dramatically. And I think having a little personal fun, I mean, I don't know what he's doing now. In fact, I should have asked, but clearly he if you see the film with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, they're going, so they're fumbling, they're what should we do? And he's telling them, this is it, exit, Brexit. Now, if you just look at the reasons, I have friends in Brussels who also agreed that they'd love Britain to be back, but of course it's just not going to happen. And you can imagine that the French were not particularly happy because the previous regime, so from 52 until 2016, the language of Europe was French. And then suddenly, the Brits arrived, they didn't speak any, and then of course you had these others who came in. Like the Nordics, and then of course once you expanded it to 27, the obvious language was English, and that's always that is our advantage, and that's obviously one of the reasons why America is the number one country. So let me see. The rationale for Brexit. The arguments that were made were things like take back control, sovereignty. Sovereignty is, when you have a relationship with Europe, you have a relationship which is substantiated by legal relationships, trade, and there's certain standards in when we're trading a bit vegetables or there's any product that has thought rather defined. You can imagine if you have 27 countries deciding on how it should be described, it's quite an arduous process. And we'd hope to simplify that, but that's but and obviously there was an argument that we were being we'd lost control of the trading rules, if you will, because we'd had to give up that a little bit to Europe. The other thing, of course, was immigration. If you are a member of the EU, you have free movement of people within Europe. And when we come to talk about, our options going forward, being a member of the EU, if you add all those other countries, Georgia, Moldova, Serbia, all these other countries which are not yet members but have made applications, the chances for immigration are coming from these countries is even more. Whereas in the past, I would have thought that, we benefited tremendously from Poles who came in and they basically, changed the quality of the services that we got in anything from plumbing to electricity or whatever you would like. So immigration, this was a big issue. Sovereignty is difficult to sort of pin down, but there was a feeling that we were subject to the courts of the international courts and so forth, and the Brits couldn't do what they wanted. But the argument that 350 million pounds per week was what we paid to Europe in order to be a member of Europe is obviously unfounded, and that the NHS would benefit. Certainly not only was unfounded, but it never happened. So, and then of course Turkey was another mention. But one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, is that the special relationship with the US. We felt that we could be in between Europe and the US, and obviously that didn't transpire. So we now go on to say the benefits that we're told of. These are sort of typically British in that they, that how important are they in terms of, not really, but they're quite, so one is no constraints on wine bottles. If Europe defines what a wine bottle should look like, how heavy it should be, etc. And whether to do it in a 0.75 litre or we Brits prefer pints. It's all this. The use of certain chemicals in sweets, they don't use titanium dioxide. I have no idea whether that's poisonous or not, but anyway, the Brits like their sweets wider. The other thing is fishing. Apparently now there are many more octopuses and lobsters and cuttlefish in the waters of Britain because the Danes and other rampant fishers mainly from the Nordics, I suppose, and from France. They will have access to all our waters, and so that's quite a big lobby. I mean, it's a small percentage of our trade, but it's important because that's the survival of our seaside towns, which are I don't know if you've been to, a lot of them are quite distressed. They have a couple of months in summer when people go to the beach, but basically, there are a lot of immigrants or unemployed, or would tend to sort of gravitate to those. Apparently, puffins are doing very well now. You can see it's a bit silly, right? And we also they're more strict on gene editing crops and things like that. So apparently in Britain, our hedgerows and wildlife are blossoming more than they have done in Europe. But I mean, it's silly. So the problem in trying to identify how the impact of Brexit versus not was that, COVID-19 came along, and that tended to scramble all the statistics and make it difficult to assess the pros and cons of Brexit. On a positive note, London still remains the number 2 world financial centre, and is strong in legal, engineering, advertising, film. But trade with the EU has dropped 32%. Wow. So it's not great. And then looking at the other costs, the British GDP per person has dropped 6 to 8% over the last 4 or 5 years. Productivity has dropped because of non-tariff barriers. I mean, basically, if you can't export, you can't optimize the size of the firm. If you have issues with marketing your products to different countries with different laws, for smaller companies, that's just too much of a burden. They just can't figure it out, and they've tended to, well, we won't bother with France or Germany anymore. And yet, I have a friend who has a whiskey business on Islay, and he has concentrated on French and German because he's figured out the documents, and he says, I can do it. And it's just that you do have to have a level of sophistication which enables you to do that. The British share of global manufacturing fell by 50% between 2000 and 2022. So obviously not just about Brexit, but apparently due to labor costs and foreign competition and energy bills. But I think it was accentuated post Brexit. And the real problem was that our access to the 500 million population of Europe was no longer our natural market. So goods exports dropped, and even services where Britain has a relative strength in some law and finance and these sorts of things has dropped, and so these are big costs, and particularly mid-sized manufacturers I mentioned have been impacted because they just cannot handle all crap. This has led to them basically they either go out of business or they stay small and they don't grow and optimize their size and their markets as they could and should. They certainly, there are a lot of companies that miss the EU supply chains, and but also, as you can imagine, if you're dealing with all these different nationalities with different products and different needs, the flow of knowledge and technology also is reduced, and that's it's difficult to nail down in numbers, but it's a very important part of a successful economy. I mean, this is why I think the productivity in Britain is not growing like it should, and in fact it's apparently less productive than France. And they are the ones who have long holidays and short days and all. I don't understand that happens. But we know that in the US, you work longer hours, have less holiday, and no maternity leave and things like that, and yet the productivity is not greater than Europe. So that's the other negatives. Of course, if you get out of Europe. Ireland is in Europe. What happens to Northern Ireland? Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland. And so this was a big sort of issue between Boris and he had to get Brexit done. So basically he landed Northern Ireland into the ocean, and he made it part of it stayed part of the EU market, and therefore was not. And that way, you didn't have to have a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland for normal goods. So it's but if you think of the implications of that, it's going to make it more and more difficult to retain Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom and Great Britain, and the slippery slope of becoming closer and closer to Ireland. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea, because the Northern Ireland is now run by Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin is also active in Southern Ireland, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. I mean, they don't. These are parties in Southern Ireland, and I would argue that they politically they're more acceptable than the party that's been running all of that for so long and has basically supported Conservative. So that's and then the question is then what are our options? I think that one of the arguments of Brexit, of course, that we can negotiate with the rest of the world and in a completely free way, but this is not what happens. The amount of trade that we can do with negotiating with India or with Australia or these other countries is very small relative to what we were doing with Europe. One thought is perhaps we should just rejoin the customs union, which is not becoming a member of the European Union, but agreeing to the sort of customs, their trade requirements. So it wouldn't allow for free movement of people, but it would be pretty much everything else. And this would help reduce red tape and cut energy costs, things like that. And we will have, there are a number of services like universities which benefit tremendously from young people coming over from Europe, and also, of course, recently from Nigeria and from the Middle East, India, and yet it's our young it would benefit enormously. Like I did, I could go as a 16-year-old. I would go work in Germany. 17-year-old, I was working in Switzerland. I basically could go all over Europe, and it was a fantastic education for a young person. And I feel that our Z generation are missing that. We haven't signed, so we could say, well, okay, we can't do customs union because it's just too much to negotiate, but we can. So they have signed bilateral deals with Germany, France, Poland, and we are working more closely with them on defence as well, which of course we have to, because now we have no big brother across the ocean. And so, my feeling is that, we would have a better chance sort of trying to fix frictions without actually trying to negotiate some big rejoining especially losing sovereignty is a very sort of emotional topic, and one that, king is a sovereign. So what happens is he's no longer sovereign. I mean, so it's difficult for the the Brits to think they're losing sovereignty. But on the other hand, if we have to work together with with Europe in order to improve our defenses and make sure that Ukraine is safe and Russia is stopped, then this is far more important than some sort of superficial loss of sovereignty, in my view. The other thing that we are having to deal with, just like every country in Europe. I mean, Italy, France, Germany, Spain. The birth rates dropped dramatically. The population is aging, and it's not quite as bad as Japan. But how are we going to fund the NHS, our National Health Service, or our other our schools and this and that if we don't have a growing workforce and a growing GDP? And so we're going to have to deal with immigration and learn how to do it in a more sophisticated way, and not like Angela Merkel, who let in 1 million the Syrians and others into Germany. Germany needs them badly, but doing that obviously just opened the floodgates and made it difficult going from there. And the other aspect, which I think which we haven't talked about, because you didn't see Nigel Farage or any others in the Brexit. But obviously the Reform Party, he was formerly UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, and there's another party called Restore. Restore Britain, which is run by a chap called Rupert Lowe, who was in Reform. And these are populist right-wingers who are not dissimilar to your own regime here. What has happened is that it's no longer just Labour and Conservatives. So we have a fractured political system. Obviously, we have Lib Dems, but they just take a small percentage. But we also have the Greens. So things are becoming. So when you have an election, you need to negotiate more and more, with other parties, so that we'll take this constituency, you take that winner, so that you end up with a majority in the criminal government in the country. So I think that that rejoining the EU is going to be problematic, because they no longer really trust us that we can. We'll have you're either dealing with the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. You're going to be dealing with, oh God, Nigel Farage. I mean, and then he's going to immediately say, "Oh, we've got to get out again." So rejoining, I don't think is an option. And as I mentioned before, I think negotiating with the EU would be a nightmare. And I think we'd be better off being very focused and looking at different areas where we can improve the flow of trade and finance, and without going into some Michel Barnier. I don't know if you remember that name, but I mean, he spent over 2 years just taking one negotiation after another with with different people who were responsible, and it is impossible to come to a proper agreement. So I mean, I'd leave it like that. And so I, having started as very pro-European, and I am still very pro-European, I just think we have to be subtly pro-European and do it in a very sort of focused way, and not try and reinvent Europe with Britain. And I think that if we can do that subtly and actively, the Dutch and the Nordics and the Baltics and these other countries would really benefit from having, because one thing that Britain is much more than perhaps the others, is that we are a market economy, and obviously we have a very strong rule of law, and other aspects which make it important for Europe going forward. So I would leave it like that. Any questions, delighted to try and answer. And we have a couple. I have at least one Brit here who can help, because it's a very it's a difficult subject, because there's no easy answer, and you know, just turning back the clock is not going to work. So thank you very much. Yeah. So, any questions?
I just have a question. Where does sort of have its place in the finance and banking industries around the world today? I mean, it used to be number one.
Is London or?
London, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Where is it now in terms of the financial?
Well, we when we got out of Brexit, when we had Brexit, we were extremely concerned that the Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and the big American offices would then move to Europe, and they did selectively move people to Switzerland, move people to Brussels and Luxembourg, but they don't speak languages. Oh, sorry. So I just, the question is, you know, will how is London faring post Brexit? And if you look at the construction of the cranes in London, and JP Morgan has just built a huge new HQ there. I mean, they're not doing it to keep it empty, and so I'm sort of quietly, but optimistic that if you look at us versus Frankfurt, or even London versus Frankfurt, or London versus Zurich, I mean, these are small towns. I mean, Frankfurt cannot take more than 1,000 new inhabitants, bankers, things like that. Just they couldn't do it, and the same thing applies. Obviously, Luxembourg is even smaller, and they're almost going to Brussels, so there's already enough bureaucracy there. So I think it's still a vibrant financial market. We've complained about we've had less IPOs than we had in the past, and a number of companies, even the British unicorns like Revolut or something like that, they're looking at states other than the UK. But we just have to not panic and keep being innovative, and so it's enough, because if the concern is where else would they go, and I used to work in Germany, and they have. It would be very difficult to have more than a specialist team of Goldman Sachs in a tower in Frankfurt doing specialist things which fit the domestic market in Germany, but they're not going to run Europe that way. It's great.
All right, you mentioned that the perception that there was excessive immigration was from certain places was part of growth Brexit in the first place. And yet, from what I hear and read, that a lot of that immigration has continued.
Yeah.
How does that affect the way people are viewing, not just Brexit, but life in Britain generally right now? I mean, there seems to be a lot.
Well, I mean, in 23 or 24, we have 1 million immigrants. Of that, 500,000 were students and their partners. So that was, good. It filled up the universities. But these the guys who came from, Pakistan, from India, from Nigeria, And they're all looking for, within the 2 years that they get after they've graduated, to find a first permanent position in the country. And we don't have, we're meant to build 350,000 new units to live in a year, and we're doing half that. It's so there is a crunch happening. Of course, the stress on the NHS, waiting times, and so forth, is deteriorating. But as I mentioned, with aging population, etc., we're going to need to have immigration. And the question is, what is the best immigration? Obviously, there is an issue about religion, and if you're importing from states from Latinos, where largely Christian, at least you don't have that issue. In the case of we have a large Muslim population, I'm not quite sure it is as much as 10%, but it's but I don't I think that we don't have the problem that France has, where their percentages are higher in terms of Muslims, and so they've stopped the burqa, the Atlantic, and there are sort of different approaches to that problem. But we're going to have to be better at managing immigration, because we're going to need it.
Has there been regret experience expressed amongst part of the population that was very pro-Brexit? Has there been any soul searching, any kind of thinking through that perhaps resulted in a good decision?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean,
How does that express?
so well, it's expressed in that number I gave you. It's 52% said they were for Brexit in 2016. And 60% say they're very sorry that we left Europe in 2025. So, I mean, it's a big change. Yes.
Hi, Alasdair, how about Scotland? Isn't Scotland more pro EU than the rest of the UK?
Yeah, I'm Scott, sorry. Then I've got, so no, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland are all pro-Europe, and they were and they voted strongly. And Scotland was 60% to stay in Europe, and of course there are only 5 million people, and in Wales it's like 3 million people. So I mean, and England is 55 million whatever. So there's in a way, they count because they have a lot of sort of government is sort of displaced to Parliament in Edinburgh and in Cardiff and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's not going to define how the UK votes. But you're right. I mean, if you go to Scotland, which I hope you do, if you go to any of the small little ports on the west coast, they always have big signs, funded by EU, funded. They benefited a lot from that. Yes.
Has Brexit increased the desire of Scots to separate from?
Well, it's interesting because the SNP, the Scottish National Party, which has been in control for the last 16 years in Scotland, has done an awful job of managing school education, schools, health, and the English pay $2,500 a year to each individual in Scotland because the taxes are insufficient to pay for welfare system, etc. So, in a way, they have completely failed the SNP to deliver what they, and then the question is, if they went independent, how the hell would they survive? They can't. What they're just bad at managing things. It's, that all the good stuff was left the country. Let's be going on for a second, right? My grandfather went to India. So they're all in the old Commonwealth and so forth. So I think that if you look at they just had an election in Scotland, and they didn't get overall control, the SNP, but because the Labour has been in the doldrums at Starmer, they didn't have the turnout that they had at the election. When they had, we had two parliaments, London Parliament, which is the, obviously the important one, where they had an overwhelming, destruction of the SNP. But that was a year ago, two years ago. And since then, Starmer has failed to maintain that momentum. And I think that they didn't have as bad a time as they were fearing. So that the SNP no longer has an absolute majority and has to work with Greens who are a bit. But SNP is a socialist party because basically there are very few companies in Scotland that where the employees are not paid for by the state. I don't think this is an investment manager will pay the difference. They manage billions out of Edinburgh, and they're the largest taxpayer in Scotland. It's just a company, so it's a real problem. But the Scots are very romantic, and they still talk about the club. But we also talk about Panic 13, 14, where we won. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be stupid. We always think that they went with their pocketbook. Scots, and so they won't. Of course, the First Minister of Scotland, who is an SNP, has promised to do another referendum as soon as he possibly can, but he doesn't have majority. This side.
Just like to follow on this, Lily's good question about, because I think the public psychology of why there's dissatisfaction now, the 60% that were regret, will affect options chosen. Do they feel misled? Did we miscalculate, or do they think we didn't do it? It was an execution problem, even though the idea was.
So the Brexiters, those that still believe, and there are a few of those, they think it's just a lack of, really doing Brexit properly. But the fact is that the people are suffering from higher costs, lower volumes of work if they have small companies, and they're suffering because unemployment is still not bad. But I mean, apparently there's about 1 million younger people who are just not employed properly. And so I think that the Brexiters, I mean, the arguments made like Turkey, immigration got worse after Brexit. So that clearly didn't solve the problem. And the boats coming across the channel is a minor story because you're talking about 30,000 a year or whatever. So I think that I'm just trying to think of who is standing up and saying, I mean, other than Farage and the Reform Britain Party, I mean, Restore Britain. These two, they think that they just get rid of Europe, but I mean, they have no solution. You ask them for their strategy on how they're going to reduce NHS waiting lines or improve schools, et cetera. They have no policies. So I think that they're. I mean, I can't name other than those those two extreme parties. If you the Conservative Party at the moment have said publicly that they're not going to seek to rejoin, whereas Labour and Liberal do, but whether they can, I don't think they can do it. In which case, they have to, I think, be more clever and try and improve the efficiency of our relationship with Europe. Otherwise, sorry.
Will you expound upon where you think Brexit was happening and what's going on currently in the United States, both current administration and politically, and then what are the core areas that you think of concern?
Oh, yeah, no, it's just I was thinking that there are comparisons. I mean, you have a country that is breaking relationships with all its allies in the West, and and I thought, well, what's that? It's you sexy. And I thought,
Yes.
and that would be very good for Trump because that's all he thinks about. But it is disturbing because obviously it's very unreliable, and we just have to agree over. I mean, our new prime minister has yet to have a visit with Trump. And obviously, he's a charming guy, and I think that he will say the right things, and he will escape on her. Yeah, but it's I mean, it's I mean, obviously, you're asking the wrong person. I think it's actually asking what's going on, and I just hope that the midterms make that clear.
I think one other similarity, as you spoke, I realized, is that the current administration doesn't have an ideology or a perspective or moral grounding. They're just trying to be opportunistic about what he gives us power.
Yeah.
For them to stay in power, much as like Boris and Nigel, how do we make up in power?
I mean, yeah, I mean,
And policy will follow, even if it's bad policy.
yeah, zero policy. I mean, it's just reacting day by day. I agree that it's very difficult for all these former allies and friends to be able to have a relationship. And obviously, Mark Carney, who he's standing firm, and you find that if he doesn't get his way, he then agrees that that's the way he wants to go. Right? I mean, it's so I think that we just have to stand firm and hopefully persuade the majority of Americans and stand to be friends in other democracies with West and obviously Canada, Australia, and so forth. But it's really difficult for them at the moment. I don't even know who our ambassador in Washington is anymore. I mean,
It's hurt the US economically too. Trade
well, it's going to. I mean, I think that's already high costs. The tariffs haven't worked in terms of improving anything. Certainly upset French cheesemakers and things like that. It's very difficult, and I just hope that it's not going to last that much longer. So,
Alasdair, though, what was Cameron thinking? I mean, obviously a lot of populist pressure, but wasn't he within his power to not just Because
Well, he was getting a lot of pressure from Farage and UKIP, you know, and no, I blame Cameron. And he didn't need to do what he did, but he was so confident that it would not come out. He also, you know, did well in Scotland, which fortunately came out in favour of staying in Britain. So he gave in too quickly to, you know, the counter opinions, and I think that was a huge mistake. And yeah, that is why and when you see what he did afterwards in his career, his lack of judgment is it's pretty prevalent, and it's surprising that he got as far as he did.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question, I looked up some numbers just before coming over.
Yeah.
And the amount that the GDP in Britain has increased over the 10-year period, it's increased by 15%. If you compare that with the United States, over the same period of time, the US GDP has increased by 80%.
Right.
Now, some part of that difference is due to this Brexit. I don't know how much, but in general, I mean, there's got to be changes.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, we talked about this the other day. Is that, you know, the economy is booming and in the US, but obviously not for the lower quintile who are suffering, and you know, they are hopefully going to react in the next election. But you're right. I mean, if you look at the other European countries, they're also not growing very fast, and yet, I mean, I don't think anyone is growing more than 3% per annum.
If that.
If that, yeah. No, if only, no. No. So, if everyone has run out of questions, so thank you very much.